Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Morning. Appreciate you being here for this session on building trust and legitimacy, civil rights and law enforcement. This initiative was started by IACP President Lou Dekmar, who's chief of LaGrange, Georgia. And Lou discovered that there was a historical civil rights incident in his community that caused a segment of his community, the African American community, to lack trust in the police department, even though he believed he and most of his current police officers were really effectively trying to build trust. So to set the context for this workshop, we're going to show you this video clip from CNN. So hopefully this will come on.
My name is James W. Calloway, Austin Calloway. He's my cousin, my dad, brother's son. If you go back to the days when lynching and beating and all that stuff was going on, nobody never got arrested for or charged with it.
Had discussions with several members of the African American community, NAACP, and decided that a way to address this historically past event, which still shapes and forms relationships today, would be an acknowledgement of the failure of the police department to protect Austin Calloway.
We come together tonight to acknowledge an injustice. Let me say emphatically, justice failed Austin Calloway.
African Americans alive decades ago can speak of incidents of terror and lynching and share an oral history about those times, which is passed on to succeeding generations. That history reflects and includes a litany of injustices among a race of people and a resulting distrust of the police. Austin Calloway's lynching is a part of that history. As the LaGrange police chief, I sincerely regret and denounce the role our police department played in Austin's lynching, both through our action and our inaction. And for that, I'm profoundly sorry. It should never have happened.
On behalf of the local NAACP and the citizens of Troup County, we accept this acknowledgement with an understanding that this act is a sincere, intentional step, as well as the beginning of a journey of a much larger initiative of trust building.
I speak your name, Austin Calloway, and ask God for forgiveness for the people that did this inhumane thing to you.
To let you know that somebody really cares. You know what happened back then in those days.
Well, a key question you might ask is, if there's a historical incident in your community that damaged trust between a segment of the community and the police department, why would the police department revisit that many years later? Now, I'm not going to answer that question because I think Chief Dekmar does an excellent job of why he decided to address this issue in LaGrange, Georgia. But one of the things it made him realize is that across America, many communities have a lack of trust with a segment of their community. And in some cases, there actually has never been trust those segments of the community have actually never trusted the police, or there has been trust and that trust has been damaged. So ICP decided to go on a listening tour, a major initiative by President Deckmeyer during his year as president, to visit some cities and hear from the community how the police department and the city can be more effective in building trust. We visited this summer 4 cities: Albany, New York; Ferguson, Missouri; Sacramento, California; and Fort Morgan, Colorado, whose chief is here. In each of these cities, there were 30 to 40 participants in each listening session, included people who were from the faith community, youth, social services, nonprofits, business leaders, educators, civil rights groups, community activists, and members of the community at large. And here are some of the cross-cutting themes that we heard from each of these communities. There needs to be more transparency by the police, more of a sense of openness as to what they do, how they do it, and challenges that they face. Youth engagement. Engage the young people, interact with them before they do so in an enforcement setting. The hiring of quality law enforcement officers. Do character-based hiring. Hire officers who have integrity, whom are service-oriented, that have good human relation skills. Training. Some of the training areas they commented on was community service, use of force, diversity, de-escalation, increasing community involvement and commitment. In many cases, they recommended that there needed to be some sort of community advisory group that works with the police to have input and feedback on both the quality and scope of law enforcement services. Creating a deeper understanding of the shared history in civil rights through that kind of training. So you can see that some central things are transparency, communication, accountability. On a deeper level, in some of these themes, agency recruitment and selection practices under hiring, increasing educational levels, increasing training opportunities, outreach through school resource officers, improving employee wellness and mental health and trauma training, developing early warning systems. So there's a number of things that the agency itself can do to help the police department develop. I might tell you that in engaging the community, we really started off with a 3-question test. That was really it. We asked them, what is it that the police department should start doing that they're currently not doing that would help build community trust? What should they stop doing, things that they're doing that really hinder the building of community trust? And then what are those things that the agency should continue doing, things they believe the agency should continue doing to help build community trust? We also asked them about, were there any key historical events that have eroded community trust? And then what can and should the community and police agency do to build the gap or close the gap that has damaged community trust? There's also some guidance from or recommendations for the community that things that the community should do. One, they should engage their local police department. 2, community members should invite the police to their community events that they have. Don't wait for the police department to engage you, engage them. Utilize your most respected community leaders to become involved with the police department. And then finally, canvass your neighborhoods during local elections and make sure your voices are heard by local public officials. Mr. President, you're right on time, really. I'm going to let you come up and talk about why you engaged in this initiative in the first place.
This isn't the introduction of the FBI director? No, I'm just kidding. Sorry, we had three different things going on and had to just briefly make them. So why the trust initiative? I think probably statistically speaking, the numbers speak for themselves. A year after Ferguson, I forget where I was coming back from, but there was a USA Today newspaper on the seat in the plane seat next to me. And the caption that jumped out at me was, public confidence in police at 20-year low, 51%. So of course I pick it up, I read the article, and it indicates just prior to Ferguson, there was, I think we were 20 institutions rated and we were third. We had dropped to fourth and we had slipped from 62% public confidence level to 51. So when I got to where I was going later in the hotel room, I Googled the Gallup poll to look at the whole thing, and we were at 51%. But President Obama was at 44%. The Supreme Court was at 32%. The media was at 19%, and Congress was at 9%. And I had asked myself, after a year of showcasing Ferguson, and then the half a dozen or so bad outcome use of force events that the media was focusing on, how is it that we maintained a relatively high confidence level? And a couple of things occurred to me. One is 75% of all police agencies in this country are 50 or less. 25% are 50% are 25 or less, and 25% are 10 or less. So the nature of policing in most communities is agencies being small enough to have a relationship with their community. And when people ask, particularly pollsters, what do you think about the police? Generally, I don't think they think about what they've seen on TV. They think about, what's my personal experience with the police? And I think that's why generally we've had favorable numbers. I think the last poll I saw 6 months ago was 74%. Now we can take solace in those numbers, but if you do a deeper dive into them, what you find is also some things that should give us some concern. Whether we're measuring 74% or we're measuring 51%, if you look where the demographics are broken down, in the minority community, particularly African American, we're always 20 to 25% less confidence level in those communities. So when we were at 51% through a general survey poll, in the minority communities, we were at 28%. When we were at 74% in the minority communities, we were in the low 50s. Because we're an international organization, I started looking at some international numbers. Canada, they were at 64% general poll, but when you look in the minority community, they dropped 40%. So what the numbers tell us is that we have work to do. Now, those are what the numbers tell you. Now, from a personal experience, what I'd like to do is share with you just a clip. Oh, you already seen the clip? You guys were really stalling for time, weren't you? Thank you. Well, on a personal experience, if you saw the clip, I just want to share with you kind of the background, how we ended up there. I was in my office and I had a captain, and she comes in and she goes, "You're not going to believe what I just heard in the hallway." And I said, "What's that?" And like any police department, along the hallways, you have the old timer pictures, folks that served turn of the century, folks that served in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 70s. And she said as she walked by to African-American elderly ladies, pointed to one of the pictures, and one kind of whispered to the other, "They killed our people." And the captain's African-American, and I asked her, I said, "What are they talking about?" She goes, "I have no idea." So I started checking, and what I found was that in 1941, the police department had arrested a young man because the records, there's no record of the arrest, there's no record of the investigation, there's no record of him being in the jail, independent of some grand jury findings. But based on news accounts, this young man was anywhere from 17 to 24. And they had taken him into custody for assaulting a white woman was the charge, which in the 1940s could be anything from rape to not averting your eyes as a white woman went by. So who knows what that charge meant. Within 5 hours of taking him into custody, five men show up in hoods, armed, and take the young man away from the police, which ought to be the most secure environment in the world, take the young man from the police, and then take him outside the city limits and shoot him 5 times. He was discovered, taken to the hospital, and died a short time later. His name was Austin Calloway. And I thought, well, golly, 7 decades ago that happened. Surely they can't still be referring to that. So then I started making inquiries with, folks that I'd worked with, mostly in the faith community, on public safety issues, and family members, of course, still live there. And although the whites in that community and many of the blacks that had moved there didn't know that history, but the people that, that has been their hometown for generations, they all knew it. And they passed that on generation to generation to generation. And that's the filter that these folks view the police. And when discussing with the NAACP president, what can be done about it, over a series of probably a year or two, as I tried to figure out, what's an effective way to deal with this issue. And then as a backdrop, we're 40 miles from Tuskegee. If you're familiar with the Tuskegee experiments, where the public health department from 1929 to 1969 intentionally did not treat African Americans for syphilis so that they could chronicle the stages of first, second, and third stage syphilis, and that went through 69. So there's some rich, tragic, ugly history in that area, in addition to that lynching and about 14 others in our area. The county that I'm in is, we have 159 counties in Georgia. The county that I'm in was the 4th largest slaveholding county in Georgia. Of the 5,000 lynchings that occurred between 1870 and 1960, Georgia was 3rd in number, about 500. So trying to figure out how to deal with this issue in a way that was going to be effective and allow us to go forward, worked with shared my concerns and how to go forward with several members of the faith community. And one elderly black lady that I'd worked years and years on, I've been police chief there for 23, 24 years. She said, if you apologize for this, you have no idea what it would mean. She said that black folks know what's gone on, and white folks want to take the position that we just need to get over it and move forward. That was yesterday. And the fact is, it's part of the history, and it's part of what influences things today. And that resonated with me. And she also said, nobody else was in the room, she said, I'll tell you something that I've never told a white man. She said, I was raped as a teenager by 2 white men, and I didn't report it because I was afraid of what would happen to my family. And so it's all that kind of history and experiences that are layered on the police experience that people have. And We can't change history, but I think what we can do is interrupt it by acknowledging it occurred and assuring folks that that's not representative of what we are today. So that brings us to the Trust Initiative. All those experiences and looking at the data played into the decision to pursue this. Anywhere I go around the world, the issue of trust comes up. You talk about cybercrime, you talk about going dark, issue of trust. People would rather have murderers go free, would rather that hard drive sit in our evidence locker where we can't access them, that has evidence of child abuse, child molestation, they would rather have that than trust us with the tools necessary to recover that evidence. And so the issue of trust is a principle of democratic policing, and if we don't have the trust of our community, it's going to compromise our effectiveness. So as a result, we announced the Trust Initiative. It consisted of a couple of components. First, we convened a roundtable of about 36 folks. Many of them are critics. In addition to law enforcement leaders, practitioners, academia, representatives from NFL, and others. And we spent a day talking about what are those things that hinder effective trust with the police and the community. And then we synthesized that information. And then we asked for police chiefs who had either had historical or contemporary events that had compromised or interfered or were an obstacle to trust. And Albany, New York, Ferguson, Missouri, excuse me, Sacramento, California, and Fort Morgan, Colorado, agreed to let us have listening sessions where they would not be present, but would allow us to conduct those. And Patrick will go, in, I think, into more depth on those if he has not already. And then the third is to develop tools and resources for leaders that say, hey, you know, I want to do something with my communities that are frustrated by the history or by an event to develop deeper trust. And we are rolling that out here. So the folks that are here have played a significant role in that, that initiative. And without further ado, I will call on the next panelist.
I'm not sure if are we speaking from the, okay, great.
You speak wherever you want.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank the IACP, particularly Chief Dekmar, for inviting me to speak today. The organization that I represent, I'm director of the Criminal Justice Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And the Lawyers Committee was established as a result of the Kennedys, particularly Attorney General Robert Kennedy, being very devoted to upholding the rule of law.
My name is James.
It's okay. He saw what was happening in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, and it was not so much a compulsion to promote civil rights as it was his offense that law enforcement officers, judges, business people were openly flouting the rule of law. There were civil rights laws in place, and rather than implementing and promoting those laws, people who were supposed to be upholding them were denying them. They were using loitering laws to attempt to prevent people from protesting. They were arresting people for sit-ins. Everything was flipped on its head. So the organization is devoted to helping individuals, usually through the support of attorneys, advance civil rights and promoting the rule of law. And the reason that that is important in the context of this conversation is that using history in order to train law enforcement officers and in order to provide experienced officers with context for making decisions is important for advancing and upholding the rule of law. And there are two things that I'd like to discuss, or two reasons I would like to offer for why that's important. First of all, for establishing and continuing to establishing the profession of policing. Second of all, for creating the cultural competency necessary to have the conversations that are necessary to build trust and to come up with solutions, collaborative solutions between law enforcement and members of the community. And the first thing I want to focus on is the issue of why this is important to the profession of policing. I think you know this innately because most of the people in this room, I know this is the International Association of Chiefs and Police, but most of the people in this room are American. You're United States citizens. And you were slowly indoctrinated into how to be an American in elementary school, whether you were paying attention to it or not. You were indoctrinated through your lessons in American history. You learned that to be an American, or to exemplify the characteristics of what it meant to be an American, was to be honest. And you learned that because you were taught about George Washington cutting down the cherry tree and not being able to lie about it. You didn't need that information to go about your daily life necessarily, but it gave you a moral foundation for making decisions. You learned about Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, because being an American is about being brave and putting yourself in harm's way in order to promote the ideal of liberty. You learned about Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, fidelity to a purpose, liberty, the American ideal that is greater than the individual. That is the point of history, and that is the way that history is used to create a moral foundation for decision making. And law enforcement is no different. Most professions are no different. Training the heart of a person, there's a quote actually by Aristotle. He said, educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. So it is necessary in professions to help people create a foundation for making moral and ethical decisions, and history is the tool for doing so. An example would be the three original professions, quote unquote, original professions, religion, law, and medicine, all use history as a tool for helping members of that profession make decisions. As a religious scholar, you might learn about the passage of scripture that, for example, Christ says something about people who are neither hot nor cold. And it's one thing to teach, oh, well, you just don't want to be a lukewarm Christian. But it's quite another thing if that religious scholar, that preacher, understands that, well, they were actually talking about a specific group of people who lived in the Lycus Valley. One part of that valley had nice cold springs that people could drink and they could store food in. The other part of that valley had hot springs that people could sit in and heal ailments. And the people that he was talking to lived in the part of the valley with stale, polluted water that literally made you sick. So, yeah, I kind of understand don't be lukewarm, but I really understand he's saying you make me sick. So knowing that history helps to implement or helps to deliver information. For the legal profession, everything that we do is grounded in history. When we learn about cases, we learn about the facts of a particular case. And we learn what was going on at that time, even if it doesn't apply now. We learn about Plessy versus Ferguson. That's not good law. Brown versus the Board of Education overturned Plessy. But every attorney learns about Plessy because we understand what was going on socially at the time, what the politics of the time were when people were trying to implement segregation as an institution. We don't just say, oh, that was in the past, we don't want to talk about it. I have to learn about Plessy so that I can understand what happened in Brown v. Board of Education when segregation was confirmed as illegal, when the Supreme Court justices reviewed the Constitution and said, you know, I think we got this wrong. So the same thing is necessary within the policing profession, to ask officers to interpret the Fourth Amendment or the Fifth Amendment without giving them the historical foundation for understanding what those things mean and how to make decisions in the moment is like giving a new recruit a gun without actually teaching them how to shoot. It is necessary as a part of the education of young officers and old that you create with them the foundation, the moral foundation for making ethical decisions. There's a quote, actually it's Justice Harry Potter, who's a Supreme Court justice, who had lots to say about the Fourth Amendment. There are a lot of cases that guide what you do as police officers that Justice Harry Potter was responsible for. But he said ethics is about knowing not just what you are able to do, but what is right to do. That's a rough paraphrase. So by teaching the history of certain events that help new recruits, new officers, old officers understand the historical foundation and the political context for the work that they are doing is an important part of making sure that your officers are prepared when they have to make split-second decisions. And also when they're making strategic decisions. They need that information for the foundation. And the medical profession is much like policing as a profession. This is new. They're doing it more now than they did in the past, and there's lots of debate and argument about whether it's necessary to teach history in order for a doctor to be able to do their job. But for a doctor to be able to understand, well, you know, I've got these African American patients, they don't seem to come in, they don't take the medicine, they don't seem to trust. It's important for a doctor to understand the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. It's important for a doctor to understand the term Mississippi appendectomy. That, you know, there was a time between the late 1960s or early 1980s when black women in particular across the South were going in thinking they were having appendectomies, but more than 150,000 women were forcibly sterilized. They didn't know that they were having hysterectomies. So that informs the way that people see your profession, and if you don't know that, you can't do your job. The same applies to policing. When the African American community in particular is thinking about stop and frisk, you know, there are a lot of arguments on both sides. Stop and frisk works this way, it doesn't work in that way. But as a police officer who is policing a community of African Americans, it is helpful for you to understand that stop and frisk is being viewed in a historical context. It is being viewed in the continuum. Before there was stop and frisk, police officers were doing what was effectively stop and frisk in order to enforce segregation. You don't have a right to be here, so I'm going to stop you and figure out why you're here because you really don't have a right to be here. Before segregation, it was Jim Crow, literally using loitering laws as a way of arresting people on false charges so that they could send them to different work camps because slavery had ended, but the job and work of slavery still needed to be done. So by arresting individuals on these charges, just kind of stopping and making things up, people were being converted into a form of slavery by going into the debt bondage, the kind of work release programs. If you've ever seen the PBS special Slavery by Another Name, it kind of outlines that. But before stop and frisk, before segregation, before Jim Crow, was slave patrols. So there were lots of free black people roaming around, living life in the United States while slavery was going on. And what slave patrols did was just stop these people and make them show their papers. My fifth great grandfather was born free, but he had to carry around a piece of paper that had his physical description and his name, and verify by court that he was free and had never been a slave. Without that piece of paper, he could have been sold into slavery, even though he was born free. So it's that context that people are viewing current events, that historical context. And it's important for you to have that information when you're deciding, am I gonna do stop and frisk? Am I gonna patrol a particular neighborhood in this particular way? And that applies not only to general historical concepts, but also specific events that have happened in your community, like what happened in LaGrange, Georgia. You need to understand those events and how people are using those events as the lens through which they are viewing police activity. And as we try and improve community police relations, if law enforcement officers are going in without that context, without that information, without those tools to say, oh, I want to improve community police relations, you're not even prepared to have the conversation. And the likelihood of success in improving police community relations is very, very low. And at the Lawyers Committee, we use this process. We use our belief in the necessity of providing historical context through our Dialogue on Race and Policing series. We just presented the first Dialogue on Race and Policing in Baton Rouge. Before sitting down with members of law enforcement, members of the community, politicians, academics, to plan out strategies for improving police relations in the community, we spent 3 weeks dissecting the history of racialized policing so that everybody in the room could get on the same page, understand what the soft points were, understand what the sticky points were, work through them, and then start to plan and move forward. So in a nutshell, I'll stop. I don't want to take up everybody else's time, but for the point of establishing the profession of policing and properly training recruits to do their jobs, you must give them an ethical and moral foundation for doing so, and history is an important tool for that. Secondly, for improving community police relations, you must have the cultural competency and have the information, the historical information necessary to allow you to have the conversation so that you can move forward in improving community police relations. Thank you.
I think you're next, CJ. Sorry, monitor hasn't done very well.
That's okay. I'm CJ Davis, Chief of Police in the city of Durham, North Carolina. And when I was asked to be a part of the Trust Initiative, first of all, I was honored to just work with IACP. And because I've known Lou for some time now, I thought this would be a great opportunity to bring some of my perspective as an African-American female and one who has been involved in a civil rights sort of history coming out of the city of Atlanta for 30 years. And even in my adolescent years, history has always played a significant role in our police department in the city of Atlanta. So going to North Carolina, one of the first priorities for me was to just learn a little bit about the history of the city of Durham. And, you know, it would help to sort of guide me as it relates to my priorities for that department. And soon I found out that the history was a rich history. Tobacco Town, there was a Black Wall Street in the city of Durham. But over the years, there had been a loss of economic value for African Americans in the city of Durham, a lot of bitterness, interactions with the police department that sometimes got blown out of proportion. And as you know, sometimes when we have incidents that get blown out of proportion, it puts a black eye on the police department, and it causes officers to have to find ways to build relationships back with the community and to dispel the myths about the police department. So our work was cut out for us. I am now 2 years in on the job, a little bit over 2 years now. But what I have found is that it's really important that officers understand why we do what we do. With new officers, our millennials, they're just like our children. They ask you why, you know, and they want an explanation, and they deserve an explanation. And the explanation will help guide them in understanding how important their role is, especially as the first encounter to the community, our patrol. So we haven't initiated what I would call history lessons in our department. But as we continue to talk about how history has played such a significant role in how communities perceive law enforcement today, we need to turn some of our recruit classrooms into history places, even to learn the history about the police department, learn about the Callaways and situations like which occurred in LaGrange that people just haven't gotten over. And it's easy to say that, but unfortunately, when lives are lost, people don't just get over it. And there is a responsibility on leadership, not just, you know, in my town. There's a lot of power in this room and in our organization to take on these types of initiatives and do what we can and what's in our power and our authority to start the conversations of reconciliation. We won't be able to convince everybody that we come to work to do a good job every day, because some people, quite frankly, just don't like police, and they never will. But I have come to the conclusion that we as law enforcement are a system of governance, no matter what agency you work for, or what color you are, or what your ethnic makeup is. Community members look at individuals in uniform as the police. We are all part of the same system. I don't get extra points when I walk into a community that's mad about what my officer has done because I'm an African American female. I'm part of a system that sometimes folks think that we just look out for each other and that we take up for our officers when they do something wrong. So it's our responsibility to convince them that first we're human beings and that we do care and we are concerned about our community and we are concerned about procedural justice and ensuring that our departments are looked upon as guardians as opposed to warriors in our community. So I was asked to just talk about a little bit about, from a local level, what we've done in my jurisdiction to try to bridge the gaps in communities of color, immigrant communities, and dealing with immigration issues, LGBTQ communities, other vulnerable communities that sometimes feel like the police just don't have their interests at heart. So one of the initiatives that I started was that I identified an LGBTQ police officer as a liaison to the LGBTQ community. There was an LGBTQ liaison in the Durham Police Department, but he was a captain and he was not LGBTQ. So it's very difficult to have an individual go into a community and really be able to address specific needs or concerns or even dispel myths about the police department if they don't understand from where that community comes from. The same with the Hispanic community. We identified a Hispanic liaison, an individual that is of the Hispanic community that understands immigration issues, the very unique challenges that immigrant communities face. And no, I didn't identify an African-American liaison. We didn't need to do that. But we did need to ensure that our minority communities, that our African-American communities had officers in those communities, not just black officers, but also white officers and Hispanic officers that understood the specific needs of those communities. In our public housing, which is primarily African-American, we now have a public housing unit. It's a very diverse team of individuals, some who were raised themselves in public housing. And they understand that there are some good people that live in public housing. And that public housing isn't all about drugs and, because the people that live there, they just want a quality of life too. So our public housing unit has gone in, and their mission is not just to suppress crime, but to establish relationships, the types of relationships where they can receive intelligence information and be more laser focused on identifying individuals in those communities that are committing crimes, as opposed to casting a wide net onto the community and terrorizing a community that really just wants to exist like everybody else. So as we start talking about disparate treatment, one of the steps that I took in my jurisdiction is I stopped roadblocks, just random roadblocks, because random roadblocks weren't being stood up in Caucasian communities or affluent communities. Does that mean there's no crime in those communities? Absolutely it is. But the perception was that the only time a roadblock was stood up was outside an immigrant community or outside an African-American community. It caused a lot of tension, and it wasn't worth it to piss off 50 people in a community to get one gun. Then you got the entire neighborhood mad at the police department, inconvenienced by the police department. Yes, we still conduct roadblocks for DUIs and other traffic enforcement, but we've been very, very careful and deliberate about how we enforce the law and making sure that it isn't perceived to be targeting certain communities. So as we talk about community trust, we also have established the same types of racial equity training, bias-based profiling training, and our Citizens Police Academy as well, that really helps to emerge our community members into the police department. I think the most exciting thing for them is to go through our shooting simulator so that they have an opportunity to see and feel how officers feel when they have to deal with split-second decisions. And sometimes it's not so easy to do that. And I would venture to say that 99% of our Citizens Police Academy members fail that particular exercise. They shoot elderly people, they shoot innocent people, and it is not to make fun or treat that particular exercise like it's some type of game. We really want them to understand the pressures of law enforcement. And it's easier to go through a practical exercise and get that experience than to just hear the rhetoric that you hear on the news about what occurred in a shooting or what sometimes community activists may have to say about a shooting before all of the information is out. So in just building trust and trying to ensure that we have a department that understands the philosophy of community policing, it's important that every level of the department, from patrol all the way to the highest in command, that the philosophy of community engagement is baked into the department. It's part of what we do every day. We talked a little bit about that in a session I was in earlier today. But each individual in a department has a responsibility at every opportunity that they have to help build that trust back. Because history does play a significant role on how our communities perceive police. And we might not be able to change history, but we certainly can change the perception of of how people feel about law enforcement today. The last thing I would like to say is that the level of communication that we have with the community and the way we communicate is really important, especially as we implement new programs. Instead of telling community members what we think they need, have them to be involved in those decision-making processes, to actually have discussions about what their concerns are and how the Durham Police Department or your police department can help resolve those concerns. I think as we talk about partnerships, you have to live it and not just talk about it. You have to be available, not just your officers, but you as a chief or an executive level staff person, you have to be engaged and be authentic in articulating what your concerns are and that you are willing to be a partner with your community. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Surratt. I just flew in from Northern Ontario. My arms are still tired. Is this on? What I'm going to talk about, ladies and gentlemen, is the experience that police have in Canada in regards to First Nations. We call ourselves First Nations people. So a lot of it's been good, a lot of it not so good. If I could get my presentation up. Okay. Okay, I'm going to start back to the birth of our great country called Canada. 1867 was Confederation. Now, all of Canada celebrated. We've reunited, or we've united ourselves. We beat the Americans in the War of 1812. I just thought I'd get that in there. It was pretty significant for us Canadians. So, but Canada was created. With that came some changes that were going to happen for First Nations people like my ancestors. Now, that fella that's in the police uniform, and this was a newspaper article from those periods of time, that was our Prime Minister. And this is how he was depicted in a police uniform. He's holding his little billy club. And the people that he's pushing right to the edge of Canada are First Nations people. There's a railroad that was put from sea to sea in Canada. They called it progress. It brought a lot of great things to our country, but it also forced our people over the edge. You either complied or you were beaten into submission. And this is where a lot of our people ended up dying over those years. So the point of this whole cartoon here is that we're establishing the police as a presence in our community, and that being the big stick that's going to beat our people into submission and move them out of the way. Oops. Now, this is where things started to change. With our new society, our communities were largely matriarchal societies. Women were the ones making the decisions in our communities. But an act in 1867, which was called the Indian Act, was passed, and it created crown policies which put our entire political system on its ear. Now women were no longer put in charge, were no longer allowed to retain their normal role as leaders in our community. They were now secondary to men. It was a part of civilizing our country, because you're talking about people that were from Europe. The new country of Canada was based entirely on the British system. We were a colonized country led by Great Britain. And in Great Britain, women did not have a great role in the community. So in order to be compliant with the mother country, we turned everything over. So many of those things that it eliminated women's opportunities, and what I'm leading into as we go along here is how it's actually affecting policing in the 20th century. This is our Prime Minister of that day, our first Prime Minister of Canada, Mr. John A. Macdonald. And this is one of the quotes. This is the mindset at the time, where now they're starting to think, now we've move First Nations people into these small, tiny reserves. We're going to now further suppress them by taking their children. I'm a father. I have a son, and if I was in that period of time, my son would be removed from my presence, or from my, he wouldn't be able to stay in my house. They would take him away. So this is where police started to get a greater role in establishing and also enforcing the will of the government of Canada. So in the United States, they were called boarding schools. In Canada, they were called residential schools. And this is a recent painting of First Nations man in Canada, Ken Monkman. This is a caricature of an event where, and those guys in the red coats, they're the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Now, they had policing jurisdiction on First Nations right up till the 1950s. So during the time of the residential schools, which started in the late 1800s, right up till 1970, there was a presence of these schools in Canada. The police played a big role. My mother was one of those people that were taken, and they had no choice. And the police were there as the strong arm of the government of Canada and forcibly removed these children. Now, in that picture, you'll notice there's a couple of priests, nuns, etc. The churches took on the role of administrators on behalf of the government of Canada of the residential schools. This is one of the things that disturbs a lot of people, but it's not common knowledge in Canada, and it's nothing that you'll see in a lot of our history books. 8,000 children died. So your child was taken away from you on a large scale, and then sadly, in some cases, they never returned. And you were never given an explanation by the church, by the police, other than that your child isn't coming home. So try and envision the fact that your child is, one, taken away. You may not see them until they're adults, and while they're away, they died. No one will tell you why it happened or how. The church helped to enforce the change in the role of women. They taught trades. Women got trades like sewing, basic nursing skills. It was something that was really a difficult thing for them, having been raised in a matriarchal society where women made the decisions. Now they were being told that that's not right. The Christian way is that men are in charge and women are no longer have a role in the decision making. So since then, there's been a commission that was sanctioned by the government of Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it took a lot of years to get an agreement from the government of Canada to support that we were going to review the role of the residential school and how it affects our communities. They're talking earlier about how when white people, I'll say the word white people, say to our communities and say, why can't you just forget? Our normal response is, why can't you just remember? It seems like they just want to forget that this event has ever taken place. And that's why it's not very well documented in our schools. It's not documented in our textbooks. It's not something that people are still comfortable to talk about. But the recommendations called for many things, including the lessons learned through the education system, integrated into the medicine that's being provided to our communities, the justice system, and lastly, the churches. And the churches, again, because they play such a great role in the development of the residential schools and the administration, one of the things that was called for was an apology from the Pope. In nomine Patre, we go through, for all of us Catholics that are in the room, we all know this saying, but the Canadian Council on Bishops recognized the need to accept the fact that the church played a great role in this, but unfortunately the Pope hasn't accepted that, and he's not prepared to apologize. And like the chief had mentioned, an apology will go a really long way. Every other church that participated has taken the time and made that apology. The only holdout is the Catholic Church, and that disturbs a lot of people, including myself being a Catholic and trying to support the church, but also recognizing that they played a role in the suppression of my people. Now we talk about earthquakes. The residential school, I guess, in our communities would be considered the earthquake. The missing, murdered Indigenous women would be considered the tsunami that came right after it. that diminished role, if you go back to that point where women were no longer the matriarchal leaders in our communities, a lot of our men got comfortable with that. I'm sad to say. They did not want to give that power back. There's a movement in some areas, localized, mind you, but there is seem to be a recognition that we need to start looking back to the way things were done. Was it better that way? Were we healthier? Were we a better community? Many people have accepted that, but others haven't, and that's why you're seeing now, we're looking at, on a latest estimate, and there's a lot of numbers floating around out there, but about 5,000 women, 1,200 of them murdered, and the other remaining group are missing. These young women don't come, a lot of our communities, they're not utopias. So they take it upon themselves. The option is they either stay in their under-resourced First Nation, or they take a chance and go to the big city. And this is where a lot of them are last seen, going into one of our larger cities, Winnipeg, Regina, some of the bigger ones in Western Canada. The amount of missing women there are just off the charts. This is our previous Prime Minister, Stephen Harper. Now, Mr. Harper had been asked repeatedly by our leadership, please consider doing a review, an inquiry. Let's do something and find out what needs to happen. There's 5,000 women missing or killed. Mr. Harper's response about the request, it wasn't really on our radar. So 5,000 wasn't a high enough number for the then Prime Minister. Fortunately, with the new government, there was an agreement finally that we're going to do a review, or we're going to do public inquiries, we're going to do an opportunity for family members to come forward and talk about their experiences. One of the themes that came up, though, and we're at the IACP here, we're talking about the response of police to the needs of our community members and how we responded when one of these events took place. It just wasn't given the support that they were expecting. The investigations were poor, to say the least. We talk about, in our country, we only make 4% of the population, but in this case, for women, represent 3% of the population, but they're 10% of the female homicides in Canada. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The math just doesn't add up. Here's my Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau. I know many of you have seen him in the news lately regarding the free trade talks. We see him all the time in our local newspaper, but many times he's crying about many of the bad decisions that he's made, and I think now his tears haven't washed away all of the pain, but one of the things he's committed to is a partnership with First Nations, trying to correct past injustices, blah, blah, blah. We haven't seen a whole lot of action as a result of that. Police interaction. Now, this young lady here lived in Ottawa. In Ottawa, which is our nation's capital, a lot of Inuit people, which are from our far north, come to Ottawa for medical treatment because there's no hospitals up there that can allow that. She had a rough life, like many of our people were living on the street, but she was a renowned artist. Her body was found in the Ottawa River. No one has been able to prove how she met that circumstance, but during that time, a member of the Ottawa Police Service took it upon themselves to put a Facebook notice out and talked about how this woman, of course, this has nothing to do with missing and murder. Aboriginal women, it's not a murder case, could be a suicide, accidental, she got drunk and fell in the river, drowned, who knows. Ottawa Police Service have done a lot of great efforts for the Inuit community that are in their city. I want to acknowledge that, but the actions of one officer and a discussion on a Facebook blog turned that whole effort upside down. So unfortunately, it diminished a lot of the great work that Ottawa was doing. And some more contemporary. These are headlines from our local newspapers. Sexual assault victim was jailed by the RCMP rather than taken to get some help. The victim was in shackles. The Edmonton police was jailed, shackled before testifying against her attacker. And then the judge saying, you're not going to remand tonight, so we can get you back here tomorrow. This is the provincial court judge. And I didn't get a chance to add it into my presentation because it happened so recently, I'm sad to say. But a judge in Kenora, or a justice of the peace in Kenora, talking to a Crown attorney, made a statement that if it was my ancestor or your ancestors would have scalped this person had this happen. And the Crown Attorney is a Mi'kmaq person from the eastern coast of Canada. So you're a Crown Attorney and the Justice of the Peace is saying, making a joke in open court saying that your ancestors would have scalped this person. Call me crazy, that's not exactly acceptable in this day and age. And my last slide, this is going on. The SQ, the Sûreté Québec, they're a provincial police service in the province of Quebec. In 2015, 35 complaints were made about the actions of a particular detachment within the Sûreté. Now, since then, there's been some suspensions and a number of other things going on, but if you notice on those officers' vest carriers, there's a little ribbon that's hanging there. And that's in support of that detachment that had all those bad incidents taking place. And they're still under investigation, but when we talk about, in Canada, we use a figure of about 35. 35 events take place before a victim of sexual assault or physical assault will actually call the police. So on number 35 event, I finally get the courage up and the ability and to muster up my self-courage and call the police. And I get an officer like this shows up. How do you think myself as a victim is going to feel if this is the response that police have? And they've been asked to take it off. Our own leadership has said, please remove these things. It's preventing people from coming forward. It's preventing others from talking to you. And we talk about that relationship building and all the great things that are going on. A group of officers just refuse to take these off. So we're not there yet. Canada likes to tout ourselves. We're always so much better and we're almost treating people better than the United States. I don't think so. We have our issues to work through too. So as a First Nations person, I just want to say to those police officers out there that are doing a good job and seeing the importance of race relations and creating those bridges, kudos to you, because truly there needs to be more of that done across our two great nations. And I'm hoping at some point my predecessor and the predecessor after that will someday say that this thing has been addressed, but we're not there yet. And I'm going to wrap up there. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. No. My name is Paul Schultz. I'm Chief of Public Safety for the city of Fort Morgan, Colorado. Fort Morgan is about 80 miles east of Denver. A little bit about our community first. We're in a rural area. We're a mid-sized city of about 13,000 people in a rural area, and a very interesting community. I've been the chief there for the last 2 years, and I didn't know a lot about this community till I got there, other than it's right on I-76, and I used to drive through it quite a bit. And of course, like several of my predecessors said, shortly before I went there, I started to study about the community, find out a lot more about it. What I found out was in 1970, there was one African American person listed in the census. In 2017, we are a minority-majority community. Population's about 48% Caucasian, near 10% African American, and about 40% Hispanic. And what caused this change, and how are we adjusting to it? Well, we have a large beef factory in town, Cargill, and they process about 6,000 head of cattle a day. And while a lot of local people work there, for the less desirable jobs, the corporation decided that they would go out and hire people from around the world. And they hired people from beginning in Central America, Vietnam, and most recently, various African countries, including Somalia. As you know, there was a travel ban put in place. So right now, their place of hire is primarily Puerto Rico. And as you walk around our community, downtown Fort Morgan, it is very common to see, especially women, in traditional African dress on the plains of eastern Colorado. Quite an interesting sight to behold, and you could imagine some of the interactions in the community during this time. So what have we done to prepare and work with this group? Well, what I found out was 2 years ago, we had very little interaction with these groups, and I was brought there to modernize the department and to also improve community outreach. So we've joined virtually every grassroots community group we can find, and we are always present at various celebrations. I now know all about Ramadan, Eid, those types of events. We have a mosque in town, and actually things are going fairly well, but you can imagine the transition in a relatively short period of time from 1970 to 2017 in our situation. In our school district, 27 languages are spoken. There are children there from literally all over the world, and today many of our community events are prefaced with the word international. How do you prepare a police department to handle this amount of change and our current situation? We have focused on de-escalation training like a lot of agencies have. We focused on community policing as well, but we also have a strong component in cultural awareness. We have consulted with a PhD from Colorado State University who visits our community regularly and actually tries to explain to our employees, to our community, the changes that we're experiencing in Fort Morgan, which are substantial. As an example, I belong to several community grassroots efforts, and during my normal work week, I'll have 2 or 3 meetings a week, every week, with various groups. One of the more interesting ones is the onboarding session at this beef plant, where they bring in every week, every other week, 20, 25 new employees. And these, again, are people from all over the world, and the people from Somalia are certainly the most interesting, a very corrupt country, and a week ago they're in this country, and now they're in the United States, and how do they view the police? How do they view the police from an environment where the police are thought of basically as criminals with guns, and now in the United States, within a week, I'm trying to explain to them that we're there to help them. And I think that they look forward to this, and certainly after we have that meeting, we do everything we can to foster a good relationship, and I think it's been going well. We are diversifying the police department. When I got there 2 years ago, we had 1 female officer. We now have 4. We had, in a community that's 40% Hispanic, not 1 police officer who spoke Spanish. Not 1. We now have 4 officers that are fluent in Spanish, and half the department has gone through emergency Spanish on patrol training, and we're hoping to get the other half in the next year or so. Interesting, the Cargill Beef Company just settled a lawsuit over a right to pray while working for $11 million, and that certainly has some reverberations in our community. So you can see it's a lot of change in a relatively short period of time that we're dealing with and trying to play catch up, trying to get ahead of the curve. What's in the future of Fort Morgan as this curve continues to evolve? I think those percentages are going to increase, and we're going to have to make sure that we mirror the community. Frankly, I'm looking forward to hiring the first Somali police officer in the state of Colorado. We had a couple of young folks that were interested in this. One young man came in and said, "I'm interested in being a police officer here. I really respect the police, but do I have to carry a gun?" And I tried to explain that, well, unfortunately, the answer to that's yes. And he was very much firearms averse. But we're working towards this. We have several initiatives in place with various segments of our community and trying to get people to want to join our department from the community that we police. It's a daily challenge in that we are trying to do the right thing and make sure we're on track with a group of people in the community that, while we all relate well, that first generation is, I have to be honest, a little standoffish. I think our greatest strength is going to be with the second generation, the kids that are in school now. So we're focusing a lot on that and as they become acclimated. We're trying to track what's going to happen in the future. One of our challenges might sound a little bit funny. While our new arrivals are just great people and wonderful to work with, and honestly, we've had no problems with them, they could definitely use some driver training. We've got some really interesting driver events from people from other countries that perhaps not used to our driving laws. So we're actually working on that with them as well. We have 2 driver schools that we work with trying to improve driver effectiveness and adherence to motor vehicle laws. I'm proud to say that I'm part of several groups that we work with, and I think that they have a new respect for the police department and for the police officers, but it does take work, and we're kind of, like I say, a unique situation. We have the second highest rate of English as a second language head of household in our state, and we're head and head with neck and neck with the city of Aurora, Colorado. But overall, when you look at all the data, we're certainly the most diverse community in our state, especially in a rural setting. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Our police department, again, is looking at trying to work with all the different groups from literally around the world. And that's interesting when there is an event, especially in Africa, that we now track on the plains of Colorado. And I find that much different than other environments that I have worked in, where we have now an international flair trying to figure out what current events are happening around the world and how that might affect us. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
All right, I'll just have kind of a few potpourri comments to wrap up. One of the points that were alluded to is civil rights training, and in preparing, once I kind of got a notion that the way to address at least the Callaway lynching was some sort of acknowledgement and apology was, the officer's input. And like many police departments, you have an annual inspection where you have the vehicles and the officers. And I have just under 100 officers, but every year, they break out information from police officer, detectives to administrative staff. And I told the division commanders before we do the inspection, I'd like to address all this personnel. And I was going to use that opportunity to kind of explain where I was at in discussing the Callaway lynching, and many of them had not heard about it. So when I discussed it with them, I outlined the backdrop of Tuskegee. I reminded them of the facts of Austin Callaway's death. I reminded them of the history that we seem to have in law enforcement as it relates to use of force issues, where if you look, since the mid-1960s, Watts, and going forward, in certain communities, there's kind of an unsettling silence for in-between issues, and then there's a bad event, and then a spark, and then riots, and then it goes back to kind of a quiet truce until the next event. And that's what we've seen in the last 50 years. It's almost predictable. In the last 5 or 6 years, certainly it has become predictable. And that we needed to do something different. And I told them, I said, I'm not so married to this that if you all have a good reason for me not to do it, maybe I'll look at, some other way. So I opened it up, and of course, nobody said anything. I said, well, then I'm going to take the fact that nobody objects as consent to go forward, and just like any other team, you've had the chance to weigh in, you've chosen not to, so I've made a decision, and I expect you to support it. I don't know what's in your heart, but I certainly will know what's in your behavior, and that's what I'll measure it by. And when I left later that day, I got probably a half a dozen typical cops. They'll never communicate in front of their peers that they're vaguely interested in anything that you say. So I get texts, though, that say, you know, you're doing the right thing, Chief, support you 100%. And I didn't hear the first bit of backlash in the couple of months after that meeting to the planning event. After the acknowledgement and apology, and I expected that, you know, we would get some state coverage. I did not expect the international coverage. And I received in a couple of 3 days, probably 200 emails and letters. Only 9 of those were negative. None of those were from serving law enforcement officers. A couple of ugly ones from retired officers. But the tenor of the responses from officers were examples of frustration and that this was well overdue. The acknowledgement and apology is not the end. That's the first step. All of us that work in diverse communities know that there are a litany of issues, not only in public safety, but public health, education, prison reentry, employment, economic. I mean, you can throw a dartboard at social factors, and any one you hit impacts the police. And so since then, we've been working closely on prison reentry. I took a police officer position, turned it into a caseworker position so that they can work with the various agencies and get people plugged into social services. Officers know that they show up on a call and they've got somebody that this person needs a lot of help and I ain't got the time. They refer it to the caseworker so she can follow up, works with homelessness, mental illness. In addition, a sticking point in our community, as I'm sure as many communities, is the educational system and the disproportionate dropout rate. And there's historically, you know, you look at policing, education, there's no day at the beach when it comes to race relations. The way the district lines were drawn 50, 60, 100 years ago still today impacts the education that folks get. So and they asked the police department to be involved in help leading this on educational reform. Now, I don't know peanut butter from apple butter about educational reform, but I do know how to convene a meeting. And I told them that, you know, I'd be happy to sponsor a meeting. And when they engaged the school board invited them to come to the school. And they said, no, we want to go to a neutral place. We want to go to the police department. And so to see the police start playing that kind of a role in these other areas continues to build on that trust. But the acknowledgement, the history, that's the starting point. That's not the ending point. So with that, I think we have a few minutes for questions. And any comments that the panel would like to make in closing.
A quick statement. Thank you for this content. More relevant than ever. It'd be nice if this session was as packed as some of the other sessions we've been to. My question surrounds educational systems and any efforts to reach out to address curriculum where some of the history that you've all spoken about is taught. I had an experience teaching community college in Portland, Oregon. And what I found was that a lot of the students who had gone through the public schools and even college in that area had no idea about a lot of the history in our community that really informed on things that were happening contemporarily. So to me, it occurred that there was some work to be done with curriculum. And I'm just curious if there's been any efforts or any successes in those areas. Thank you.
Yes. One of the themes, and I'll ask the panel to comment also, one of the themes that came out of this was a lack of understanding and history of civil rights. In fact, I think it was Ferguson, Missouri, where one of the ladies said that, you know, one of the problems is the police around here don't understand the history, and how come y'all don't have some kind of civil rights history? And that is part of the Trust Initiative. And Patrick, Shannon, I think.
There are efforts underway both on local national levels. Post in every state defines and decides what training is right and needed and what is not. So part of that advocacy effort is to encourage Post, to work with them, to reach out with them, to establish some type of training. We are using hate crimes in particular as a vehicle for introducing that. We've been working with IADLS to introduce hate crimes training into curriculums. Also, we've been in discussion with the IACP about considering what type of training protocols, what type of curriculum might be necessary, might be best to try and introduce this historical underpinning that is going to give people the types of experience that allows them to examine a set of facts and apply those facts. This is what happened then, this is what went right, this is what went wrong, this is how I understand how to apply that if I find myself in that situation. That's the importance of history and ethics training, and that's why ethics and history are such an important part of any profession. So there are things underway. What would be most helpful is if you, active police officers, begin to demand the training. I think that would move the ball quite a long way.
All of you have a booklet in front of you with some recommendations that are in it based on the Trust Initiative. And in the training area, three things that are highlighted are crisis intervention training, cultural diversity training, civil rights and race relations training. Just as a point of privilege, something I point out to you, even though during the War of Independence there was slavery going on in the United States of America, in the Declaration of Independence, most people have read the declaratory statements, but what they have not read are the 27 grievances that the colonists had against King George III. You might read those. Those are very, very interesting, why they made the decision they did to declare their independence. Because all of you know that the 54 signers of that document all basically committed an act of treason, which is punishable by death. But why did they do that? And understanding that, that document later related to the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights really are 10 fundamental rights that every person has from intrusion primarily from government. So the fundamental purpose of every American peace officer, my favorite title for law enforcement officers, is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
We've got a couple of programs that we've done in the past. One we started last year and will carry over this year, a youth outreach program that focuses on a touching of this, I should say. And also our consultant from State University teaches a class at our local community college that also covers this ethics training. But one of the more interesting things we had in Colorado was we had a grant for a period of time where we were sending command officers to the Holocaust Museum in Los Angeles, which we found to be very valuable. It covered a lot of similar topics.
And this is the report that's rolled out, and is it in the back? Yes, and it's in the back if you all want to grab a copy of it. Yes, sir.
Hi, Sean Hill from California. Thank you for your time today. I spend a bit of my time trying to collaborate and improve relations with marginalized community members in the area that I work, and I find two of the biggest challenges are having those community members want to come to the table with the police, and also the process of the rollout to the officers. Those are, I find, very challenging, so I'd love to hear any thoughts on those.
Well, I can tell you that the predicate for our acknowledgement apology was probably a 2-year period. It started first with the recognition of the political leadership, which is 3 cities in the county government, that we are about 50% African American and 50% Caucasian, and we needed to do something different. And as a result, they started race relations training or trust building training, and selected leaders from across the communities. And I think it started with 40 of us, day and a half training. And that really allowed you to kind of get some stuff behind you so you could have very candid conversations without people looking for an opportunity to grab a trigger word and get focused on that instead of what the intent of the speaker is. So that was one way. And then, of course, with regard to the officers, is just being candid with them. There's a book, it's called Parting the Waters by a fellow by the name of Branch. And I've got I've read it. I've got my training lieutenant reading it, and he's going to put together a civil rights training for us on that I hope will further outline what the hindrances are and obstacles for law enforcement. Yes, sir.
Good morning still. In watching the PowerPoint that our brother from Canada indicated, it was very poignant and indicated that the police were tasked with acting as agents of the federal government, basically to undermine the native population there. We can actually say the same exact thing here in America during 100 years of Jim Crow. I just want to know, how far are we going to go as far as unpacking all of this stuff? Because there's a lot of stuff, okay? This has to do with free labor, cheap labor, divide and conquer of the races. Are we ready to come clean on it all and unpack the whole suitcase? That's my question.
I think the short answer is no, but but I do think we have to take some steps in order to get ready. I was interested in hearing about the boarding schools. There's actually a similar practice in the United States through apprenticeships. Free black people made people very afraid historically before the Civil War. So our version of the boarding schools was that if there was a free black child, 9 times out of 10 their family was poor. So the state would go in and remove those kids and place them in apprenticeships, which was basically converting the children to a condition of slavery. And they would learn a trade until they were 21, and then their apprenticeship ended, which was, I spoke earlier about my ancestor who had freedom papers. That's why, following his apprenticeship. Those are hard conversations to have because race permeates everything that we do, because the United States was established on a system of creating one class that was less than another. And in order to maintain that, the law had to be implemented in a way and established in a way to create that situation. It was not the natural situation of blacks to be enslaved, but the law created that situation. So being able to unpack the role of the law and the role of law enforcement in creating a racist system is very difficult. It's like untying when you make a ball out of rubber bands. It's really, really difficult to do. But there are ways to start that conversation. And Chief Schultz mentioned the Holocaust training. More than 200,000 law enforcement officials across the United States have received training from the United States Holocaust Memorial and Museum. And by allowing law enforcement officers to examine from a distance, you might not be ready to understand the role of the law enforcement in the Tulsa race riots. That might be too close, even though the mayor has recently reopened an investigation. But understanding the role of law enforcement in Kristallnacht in Nazi Germany creates enough separation for law enforcement officers to be able to say, okay, what are the facts? And if I were a law enforcement officer in that period of history, what would I have done? What decisions would I make? And how does that inform what I do now? And by using distance for that type of training, you create a space that prepares law enforcement officers to have the conversation about what happened in Tulsa, to have the conversation about what happened in the Red Summer of 1919, to have the conversation about what happened in Rosewood, Florida. So it's a step-by-step process, but we do have to begin to take the steps and to use the tools that are currently in place that help us take those steps.
We've got time for one more question.
Thank you very much. I am working on the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, which is a national pilot project on police-community relations and has a large part on reconciliation. And we are working with a number of departments around the country to help them partner with local libraries or civil rights institutes to learn about this history. And I'm happy to speak with others if they're interested in that, because it's something we're continuing to do. But I'm curious to hear from the panel about how we can frame this as being so essential to public safety in terms of this relationships between these communities and the police, because sometimes we hear that these trainings are for feel-good reasons rather than the essential, and that is certainly not sort of the opinion of the work that we do, but I'm curious to hear from your expertise as how we can frame the essential importance of everything that you're talking about.
We frame it that it's necessary for public safety and better understanding and the ability to literally get along with the community and community policing. It's framed that we need to all work together. And our community is so international in scope that I actually have people from countries that I had not heard of before, that we have looked them up to find out more about them. So it is truly a public safety perspective.
Thank you all for coming.